So in Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Angela Davis writes that neoliberalism attempts to force people to think of themselves only in individual terms and not in collective terms. And throughout most of my life, she says, I've internalized the belief that every American, regardless of race and class, has the opportunity to succeed in the United States. My generation has been told since birth that if we study and work hard enough, we too can build businesses or become billionaires. This is a lie, Davis writes. We chase after individualism as Americans and are left empty because racial capitalism exploits the work and subsequent failures of Black people, immigrants, working class, indigenous, Asian Americans, gay, lesbian, and transgender people, and countless other marginalized communities. So the key word there is racial capitalism. And the Harvard Law Review defines racial capitalism as the process of deriving social and economic value from the racial identity of others. To put this slide in green to symbolize money. And in 2020, the American rich got richer, even during the global pandemic, thanks to racial capitalism. Capitalism has created a very world in which white people have made millions in the cannabis industry, while Black women and men serve time for weed possession, where working class people have labored in toxic workplaces, while politicians and CEOs use the pandemic to get richer. Racial capitalism created the very world in which, this is Segura talking about her Black father, who previously worked as a truck driver and often delivered to and from Amazon factories along the Northeast, was forced to choose his health over work, while white men such as Jeff Bezos added more than 20 billion to their net worth in 2020 alone. This is in stark contrast to Acts 4th chapter, verses 34 and 35, that says, there was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet. It was distributed to each according to their need. And we also remember the story of the young man who asked Jesus, what shall I do to get eternal life? And Jesus said, keep the commandments, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't give false testimony, honor your father, your mother, love your neighbor as yourself. And the young man said, I do all of these things. What do I lack? And Jesus said, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. And this is in Matthew 19, verses 16 through 22. And so when the young man heard this, he went away sad because he had great wealth. And this is the only place in the Bible where the word sad is used. So going back to Segura, she points out that white men make more money than any other group and are overwhelmingly better represented in politics, academics, journalism, and Hollywood. We will never overcome such disparities, Leslie Coven says, unless our faith leaders, along with white lay Catholics, comprehend and actively work to relinquish their power. White Americans, she proclaimed, have been indoctrinated to believe that it is their right to be superior to all other citizens, a bias that is often unconscious. Now, so what I say is that white people didn't ask for power and privilege, and you can't give away your inherent privilege, but you can be an active bystander, which we'll get to that phrase in a minute. So to be a resurrected church, she said, our faith leaders must begin to renounce their own power and listen to the wants, needs, and concerns of Black Catholics. Another green screen symbolizing money. Segura points out that in 2018, the total revenue for USCCB was $203 million. And she says they could allocate some funds from various collections to support marginalized communities, but bishops are afraid to come to terms with terms like white privilege and white supremacy. And our own church, which claims to internalize the gospel, enslaved Africans, Our own church used Black women and men and children to promote their own well-being and success over Black livelihood. Throughout the American church's history and well into the 20th century, religious orders were also actively working to keep Black women and men out. And so her fourth point here is that all of the violence of the current world, uh, which belief in the resurrection actively and consistently rejects, was caused by the white supremacist need to dominate people seen as other and the antithesis to the perceived goodness of whiteness. So the church needs to shift from one that's centered on power and leadership of mostly white, all male clergy to one that supports the concerns of Black women and men, both financially and pastorally. And one way could be for church leaders to listen to the needs and wants and demands of Black Catholics through ongoing dialogue, which could include homilies on white privilege and anti-racism. So I thought this was interesting where Sakura talks about one incident when she was in Catholic school that most angered a teacher, was when a student during a class assignment painted Jesus as Black instead of white. And the student was punished because, according to the teacher, depicting Jesus as anything other than white was wrong. So my first reaction was to be critical of that teacher, but it's easy for me to judge. But we and I have to keep in mind how we've all been socialized, because that teacher, it could have looked like me. So we consider the example of the religious rationale of the doctrine of discovery that has influenced all of us. Way back in 1493, the year after Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull that validated European conquest, and that the Catholic faith and Christian religion should be exalted and spread everywhere. Um, that passage and similar passages gave rise to Christian colonialism and Christian nationalism. As Segura called it, imperialism. So it gave a theological permission for the European body and mind to view themselves as superior to non-European bodies and minds. And the doctrine created an identity for African American bodies as inferior and only worthy of subjugation. And we all, drank that Kool-Aid. And someone said it's baked in the cake of this country. It also relegated the identity of the original inhabitants of the land, quote unquote, discovered, to be outlawed and now unwelcome in their own land. So we've all been socialized for centuries to see Jesus as white. Thankfully, back in 2001, a retired medical artist named Richard Nev led a team of Israeli and British forensic anthropologists and computer programmers in creating a new image of Jesus based on an Israeli skull dating back to the first century. He used computer modeling like forensic scientists use and their knowledge of what Jewish people looked like at the time. So no one claims that this reconstruction, the bottom two pictures, is exactly what Jesus looked like, but that's what Nev came up with from his reconstruction using forensic science skills. But scholars believe that the bottom image of someone about 5 feet tall with darker skin, dark eyes, and shorter, curlier hair is more accurate than the artistic depiction like we see above. But almost all scholars agree that Jewish Galileans 2,000 years ago probably didn't have blue eyes and long blonde hair. So many in the church have turned a blind eye and a deaf ear to the oppressed, to the marginalized, to anything but white history and white culture. Richard Rohr, who runs the Center for Action and Contemplation and writes daily meditation, talks about the oppressed being the outcasts of society. And he reminds us that systemic oppression has been with us since ancient times, and that the Bible is written from the perspective of the oppressed. We see in the Gospels that the lame and the blind and the lepers tended to follow Jesus, and that Jesus lived close to them or in solidarity with those on the outskirts of society, those in group 2. And those on the inside, at the center of power, those in group 1, were the ones who crucified him. In his May 24th, 2020 meditation entitled Invitation to Solidarity, Rohr says that the Bible reveals a liberating path of humility, compassion, and nonviolence in the face of oppression that culminates in the life, ministry, and state sponsored execution of Jesus. But we still honor people in power and we shun the oppressed. So, and as Segura mentioned yesterday, a religion and the empire colluded in killing Jesus. But if Jesus were walking around in human form today, he might look like the picture we just saw. He might look like this. He might look like Eric Garner. He might look like George Floyd. Or as a non-white person, he might be subject to racial profiling and to imprisonment. In the 20th century expansion of the American jails and prisons, uh, they were backed financially by private American corporations and industries such as healthcare, construction, and food. And Segura talks about that on page 113 of her book. Uh, so we see that the United States has only 4% of the world's population, but 25% of the prison population. In 2019, the federal prison industry's net revenue was more than $500 million, with more than 200,000 American citizens being incarcerated in private prisons, which make more than $5 billion a year. And as of 2020, there are more than 2 million people incarcerated across the country, in prisons, juvenile jails, detention centers. And so that number has increased dramatically from the 126,000 we saw in 2015 on this slide from Pew, just 6 years ago. Since the creation of the first jails and prisons, the prison industrial complex has been America's strongest economic industry since chattel slavery. It has always been protected and served by US law enforcement. Policing enables the exploitation, torture, and slave labor of the prison system by violently harassing and targeting already marginalized communities, particularly Black men and women. This is on page 116 and 117 of Segura's book. And since the earliest days of slave patrols and the creation of the first American police departments, white men, with the backing of an emerging racially capitalist system, and also the KKK were infiltrated, established white supremacist government. They also stole more than 1 billion acres of land from indigenous Americans. And you see here the decline from 1775 to 1850 and so forth. White men believed that it was their destiny and God-given right as Christians to take possessions and land and exploit Black and indigenous citizens. So creating a world free of violence and oppression requires a society to shift from one that relies on the prison industrial complex to one that is committed to using radical approaches to eradicate social ills that cause incarceration, including addiction, homelessness, mental health problems, and housing. So reiterating that a world free of violence requires transformative justice, transforming police, and not necessarily putting all of our possessions at the feet of the apostles, or like the young man selling all his possessions, but what other transformation or radical out of the box thinking can we employ? So a breath of fresh air, a ray of hope, came in May 2020 when 6 bishops, including Bishop Shelton Fabre, and the other 5, I just picked Bishop Fabre since I've met him on several occasions, Bishop of Houma Thibodeau in Louisiana. But those 6 bishops said, racism is not a thing of the past or simply a throwaway political issue to be bandied about when convenient. It's a real and present danger that must be met head on. As members of the church, we must stand for the more difficult right and just actions instead of the easy wrongs of indifference. While it is expected that we will plead for peaceful nonviolent protests, and we certainly do, we also stand in passionate support of communities that are understandably outraged. And so, we need these to be more than words as well. But one step that the church can take is for dioceses across the country to develop anti-racist training for all clergy in formation, especially white priests, to understand systemic oppression more fully. And this photo is from the Brooklyn religious leaders who hosted an anti-racist training. And so my last quote from Segura before we segue into the next segment of this presentation is that an abolition framework is one that aligns not just with our Catholic faith, but also with the guidance of Pope Francis. And she talked a lot about Fratelli Tutti. So the next few slides, I've excerpted quotes from Fratelli Tutti for the guidance that Pope Francis gives us in his 2020 encyclical. Paragraph 18, Pope Francis says, some parts of our human family, it appears, can be readily sacrificed for the sake of others considered worthy of a carefree existence. Ultimately, persons are no longer seen as a paramount value to be cared for and respected, especially when they are poor and disabled. They're not yet useful, like the unborn, no longer needed. This way of discarding others can take a variety of forms, such as an obsession with reducing labor costs with no concern for its grave consequences, since the unemployment that is directly generated leads to the expansion of poverty. In addition, a readiness to discard others finds expression in vicious attitudes that we thought long past, such as racism, which retreats underground. That's from paragraph 20. The way of discarding others can take a variety of forms, such as obsession with reducing labor costs with no concern for its grave consequences, since the unemployment that it directly generates leads to the expansion of poverty, which of course we saw during the pandemic. And destroying self-esteem is an easy way to dominate others. So, although so much of the Fratelli Tutti is focused on the Good Samaritan, and although the parable was written 2,000 years ago, it can provide a ray of hope for us today, Pope Francis says in paragraph 56. He says, the joys and hopes and griefs and anguish of the people of our time, especially of those who are poor and afflicted, are the joys and hopes of the grief, of the anguish of the followers of Christ. And I think I only have a few minutes left, so let me just see how I can skip, because since we lost time in the transition of the technology. But so I think you all know the story of the Good Samaritan, where people were trying to trick Jesus and ask him, what should they do to inherit? And he said, love your neighbor. And he said, who's my neighbor? And so he told the story of a man going down from Jerusalem who fell into robbers' hands, and they beat him. And so then there was a priest who crossed the road when they saw him, and a Levite did the same. But the Samaritan put him on his own animal, brought him to the inn, and took care of him. And so, which one of these do you think was the neighbor? And of course, it's the one who showed mercy. So in context, Pope Francis says that, we see people assaulted on the street and we hurry off. We try to avoid our problems, and it doesn't matter that through another fault that the person could die. Through no fault of theirs, a person could die. What's more, caught up as we are with our own needs, the sight of a person who is suffering disturbs us. It makes us uneasy, since we have no time to waste for other people. And society that seeks prosperity but turns its back on the suffering is something that we hope we don't sink to such depths. And we look at the example of the Good Samaritan. Jesus' parable summons us to rediscover our vocation as builders of a new social bond, and lets us be grounded in the fundamental law of our being. We are called to direct society to the pursuit of the common good with that purpose in mind. And so just a couple other points for this. The Pope talks about the nervous indifference that makes the Levite and the priest pass to the other side of the road. And then, one detail of the passerbys is that They were religious. They were devoted to the worship of God, and this detail shouldn't be overlooked. It shows that belief in God and the worship of God are not enough to ensure that we are actually living in the way that's pleasing God. That's from paragraph 74. And so the parable eloquently presents basic decisions we need to make in order to rebuild our wounded world, and shows us how a community can be rebuilt by men and women who identify with the vulnerability of others, who reject the creation of a society of exclusion, and instead work as neighbors, lifting and rehabilitating the fallen for the sake of the common good. So, John, I don't know if you can do the video now of
Sure.
Okay.
And I was just going to let you know we are good to go a few minutes past. Johnny let me know before we're whooshed back, so no need to rush on any of these sections. So we've
Okay,
got
so
this.
Perlette, after the video, Perlette, I only have 2 more slides. Okay.
I will go ahead and share. If you want to stop sharing, I'll share that video. Can everybody see the video, presenters?
Yes.
Perfect.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white. Blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me. And she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who's a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up. And says, yes. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you got to choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over, and she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been. She goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. And it's totally unacceptable. At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the Black woman said, "This is unfair. Why are you doing this to me?" Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
Okay, so now let me try to share my screen for the last two slides I have. Okay. So looking at this as the active bystander concept, connecting the dots to the Good Samaritan. This parable, the parable speaks, and the example we just saw from, that was Joy DeGruy, who's the author of the book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, who was on the video. And the video is called Cracking the Code. But the parable speaks to us of an essential and often forgotten aspect of our common humanity. We are created for a fulfillment that can only be found in love. We cannot be indifferent to suffering, even if it's being treated wrong at the grocery store. We cannot allow anyone to go through life as an outcast. Instead, we should feel indignant, challenged to emerge from our comfortable isolation and to be changed by the contact with human suffering. That is the meaning of dignity. And that's Pope Francis's words from paragraph 68. And then finally, Jesus does not offer alternatives. He doesn't ask what might have happened had the injured man or the one who helped him yielded to anger or a thirst for revenge. Jesus trusts in the best of the human spirit. With this parable, he encourages us to persevere in love, to restore dignity to the suffering, and to build a society worthy of his name. Amen. So let me stop sharing and turn it over to Perlette.
Grab that real quick.
So recently, I binge watched the series Indian Summers that take place in India. It's a PBS masterpiece series, and I love PBS masterpiece. I don't know how much of the series is based on fact, but the creator of the series did an excellent job bringing to light the complexities of internalized racial oppression experienced by people of color, white privilege, and the bystander theory. Actually, there are plenty of movies and television series that brings these concepts to light, but to see them, we must look at them through the lens of anti-racism. And I love that video, that short video that we saw with Vicky's presentation, because it was very clear in her story, the bystander theory. And when we look at television, or if we look in life itself, we don't see it that clearly when it happens. And that's why we need to understand exactly what that looked like. And so I encourage you to look at Indian Summers, because to me it's very clear of the different aspects of the bystander theory, where the British stand there and watch things happen with people of color or between people of color, or just do nothing when suffering is happening. Or you look at the white privilege that happens in that, and you see how they just stand by knowing it's wrong, but does nothing. So in this last section of this presentation, I want to remind all of us of the challenges that Father Brian Maskell has presented to Pax Christi over the years. As we know, or at least it should be common knowledge among Pax Christi membership, that Father Brian Maskell is a theologian, an author, a scholar, activist, and a 2021 recipient of the Pax Christi USA Teacher of Peace Award. He actively engages in dialogue on justice issues within and outside the Catholic Church. We know, or at least it should be common knowledge among Pax Christi membership, that our Bishop Stowe stated that he had often referred to Father Massengale as his teacher in such matters as understanding and responding to systemic racism. And we should know, or at least it should be common knowledge, that Father Massengale authored the book Racial Justice and the Catholic Church that was published in 2010. And as I mentioned earlier, we may or may not know, depending on the length of our relationship with Pax Christi USA, Father Massengale spoke at a Pax Christi USA conference at least 3 times, 2003, 2010, and 2013. Next slide, please. The first time he spoke was at St. John University in New York, soon after we established our anti-racism team. During this talk, Father Massengale spoke of the importance and gave us an overview of racism in the church and other Catholic entities and what we could do to combat it. The second time he spoke, we were in Chicago. Father Massengale brought up his analysis of Malcolm X. As I sat in the back of the room, I could hear the shock vibrate throughout the room when he mentioned Malcolm's name. Our systemic racist society has told us that Malcolm stood on a foundation of violence, when in fact, Malcolm responded to racial violence, yet he was labeled a terrorist, and people still today consider his work towards racial justice as a terrorist movement. In 2010, Father Massengale was elaborating on the theme of the conference, No Justice, No Peace, Ending War at Home and Abroad. In the article published by the National Catholic Reporter and written by the NCR staff, I was not surprised that Malcolm's name was not mentioned. PCUSA, as well as NCR, failed to recognize that Malcolm, along with the Reverend Martin Luther King, was committed to end racial injustice and to alleviate crushing poverty. Both Malcolm and Martin recognized the interconnectedness of the triplets of evil: imperialistic militarism, materialism, and racism. The third time Father Massengale spoke to Pax Christi USA was in 2013 in Atlanta. He spoke about the browning of the church. He stated that if Pax Christi is going to be alive in 40 years, it must embrace the future, a brown future. He emphasized 8 years ago that if Pax Christi wants to remain relevant in today's society, it must become a multicultural Catholic peace and justice movement. A Catholic peace with justice movement. I ask you today to look around, scroll through the attendees. What do you see? Who do you see? And what communities are missing? Next slide, please. In 2013, Father Massengale emphasized that Pax Christi USA membership is on the front lines, the church's witnesses to peace, reconciliation, and nonviolence. We are faith-filled activists, but he also asked, what is the relevance of Pax Christi today? What are the challenges it must address to embrace the future? What values and priorities need to be embraced by Pax Christi USA to become who we say we are, a multicultural, anti-racism, Catholic peace with justice movement? Next slide. I need the first audio, John.
Here. None of us can state with absolute certainty what are the challenges that await us. And yet the word relevant provides a clue to a possible approach. Dictionaries give the following synonyms for relevant: significant, indispensable, pertinent, vital, or as I would put it, worth my time and attention. Movements that are on the frontiers of action, movements that are on the frontiers of action and reflection, they claim my attention. They attract my notice. They spur renewed commitment and energy. The opposite of relevant: obsolete, yesterday, outdated, tired, boring, not worth my time, energy, or commitment. Movements that are not responsive to pressing concerns, or movements that want to play it safe. You see where this is going, y'all. What I'm going to put before you is a challenge. If Pax Christi wants to remain relevant, it's got to stay on the synonym side of the ledger. If it wants not to be relevant, obsolete, yesterday, outdated, tired, and boring, then it's going to have to simply play it safe. So the question that we put before us is this: what are the values, priorities, and concerns that Pax Christi USA must commit itself to embracing if it's going to be relevant, if it's going to have a significant claim to attention in the world and the church that is coming to be? Say amen. Amen. But that leads us to the challenge. What will this assembly look like 20 to 30 years from now? No, not like this. But then let's go deeper. What must Pax Christi USA look like in 10 years if it's going to exist 20 to 30 years from now? I dare say it's going to have to look markedly different if it's even going to gather then. If Pax Christi USA is going to be a Catholic peace with justice movement, then the future of Pax Christi USA is brown. I applaud Pax Christi USA for your commitment to being an anti-racist, multicultural peace with justice movement. I applaud that. But the next step is to recognize how deeply, even with the best of intentions, this organization and even we as individuals have been malformed by and have absorbed the unconscious racial code of our society. So if Pax Christi USA is going to have a future in a browning nation and church, then it must not only proclaim it is anti-racist, it must not only cultivate cross-racial solidarity, it must also confront and lament its unconscious racial malformation. This is something this organization must do, because without it, your commitment to nonviolence is compromised. And without it, you don't have a future in a browning church and society. Amen.
So Father Massengale repeated his message from 2003 and 2010 about the interconnectedness of racism and the triplets of evil. He re-emphasized that as a Catholic peace with justice organization, we need to address injustices that affect the urban community as well as the suburban community. As a Catholic peace with justice organization, we need to address violence at home and abroad if we are going to remain relevant in today's society. Peace is no longer a single issue struggle because people do not live single issue lives. It is no longer militarism, materialism, or racism. It is a justice issue because all of it is intersectional in our homes and abroad. It is a twisted together violence without justice. So my question today is this: if we were at a crisis point 8 years ago, where are we now? In an article, next slide, yes. In an article published by the National Catholic Reporter and written by Patrick Neal in 2013, Sister Patty Chappelle asked the question, does Pax Christi really want to look at the whole issue of anti-racism? If they do, they do. If they don't, let's just say it and move on. Next slide. Here are a list of resources that I think would be very fruitful for people to read. Father Brian has been very vocal, especially in the last year, on racism in the church. And he has spoken through and to a lot of audience. The first one, The Racist Sitting in the Church, was a virtual presentation geared towards the Black Catholic community here in the US. Next slide. So finally, Frank will lead us through the next section. The discussion will center around these 3 questions, and then he has a 4th one. Thank you much for listening.
Oh, Frank, you're muted.
Oops. Well, I was saying that I really want to extend my thanks to my 2 colleagues, Perlette and Vicky, for very informative presentations, for helping us to understand some of the dynamics of systemic racism, particularly in our own church, and the challenges that Pax Christi faces in the future. As I mentioned before, there's a Google Doc. I'm going to put the link in the chat again. A Google Doc for you to offer your thoughts to the 3 questions that that Father Brian Massengale presented 8 years ago. What is the relevancy of Pax Christi USA today? What are the challenges it must address to embrace the future? What values and priorities need to be embraced by PCUSA to become who we say we are, a multicultural Catholic peace with justice movement? And then finally, a more personal one, what can you do outside your comfort zone that will help PCUSA become an anti-racist organization? So for the next maybe 5 or 10 minutes or so, I'd like you to fill in answers to those. Some of you have already done so before the presentation, but now it might be interesting to see what people have to say after the presentation about the relevancy, the challenges, and the values, priorities, and personal steps that each of you can take. While you're doing that, there was one. There's also time for questions for the presenters, if you had any questions. And a lot of people put some comments in the chat during the presentations, but there was one real question that came up that I'd like. It was a question for Vicky, or it came from part of Vicky's presentation, and so while you're writing in the Google Doc, maybe Vicky could start to answer this question, and then if you have any others, please put them in the chat. Could we talk about how to strike a balance between using our white privilege to stop injustice, as in the video, to strike a balance between using white privilege to stop injustice, and then balance that against letting the person being harmed decide when and how to object? And the person asking that question said, I don't want to prevent someone from speaking for themselves, but I know how important genuine allyship is. So it's a question about, when do we use our white privilege to help, and when do we let others speak up for themselves?
Okay, so we all have different personalities, and I have an outgoing personality, but if some white person wants to be an ally and speak up when they see an injustice, microaggression against me, speak up. Most of us, I think, will say that we are overwhelmed and saturated with microaggressions on a daily basis, and we are exhausted. And so many things that I would let go and not choose my battles. If a white person wants to speak up and fight that battle for me, by all means do it. And just on a broader scale, let me say that we know, historically, none of the civil rights, the civil rights wasn't successful with Dr. King until white people joined. If you've seen the movie Selma, that's a great representation of what happened, when, we were trying to do things for ourselves. And of course, we need to speak for ourselves. And if there's something clear, like the example in the, in the grocery store, or the Good Samaritan, of course, it's a judgment call. But if the question is, will my whiteness be seen as more acceptable in this situation than this Black person speaking in this situation? By all means, speak up, because we have, plenty of, I would never feel that you're taking my voice from me if you're speaking on my behalf. That's my view.
Thanks, Vicki. There's another question, sort of a follow-up to that, that says, what if I don't recognize a microaggression against me, but others do?
If you don't recognize a microaggression against you, but others
yes.
do, that. So, I mean, I guess maybe that's a person of color asking.
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
And okay, so that's kind of tricky. That's personal. Just let me give you an example. I was with my grandsons in it wasn't a grocery store. It was like, anyway, we were let's say let's say it was the grocery store, and we were checking out, and they were maybe they're 11 and 9, so they were maybe a couple of years younger, and a white woman came up and said, "Oh, look how cute," and just patted them on their head. Like, to me it was a microaggression, that it was like, a petting zoo, and I was boiling. But my grandsons didn't react, and my son and daughter-in-law were right there, and they just kind of smiled and said, huh, like that. And so, I felt it wasn't my place to speak up, and so it's, again, it's a tricky question, but and people have asked me, oh, can I touch your hair? And I said, that's okay, but I haven't been upset with them because in again, in my opinion, and all of us have, we're not monolithic as people of color, that intention has to do a lot with it. But we also, I think, have an obligation to, we can have some teachable moments. And just one other example, I had a case yesterday where someone was talking about dreadlocks, and it was a person of color was talking about how the policy at that organization had changed on, allowing quote unquote dreadlocks and not allowing them. And so I said to her, in a sidebar, we don't know the origin of that term, but one explanation is from Australia centuries ago, where the quote unquote Aborigines were seen coming out of their inhabitants, and white people said, "Oh, look at those dreadful locks." And so when I said to her, my locks are not dreadful, and so I just call them locks. I don't call them dreadlocks. And so the rest of the discussion, she called them locks. But I'm not going to correct. My hairstylist, when she's doing my hair, she says dreadlocks. So it's there's so many nuances there, but many of us are unaware of what others of us see as microaggressions, such as calling each other the N-word in a loving way, which I never do, and many of us never do, because then white people do it. But so it's in our cases, we have been socialized to see ourselves as less than, and so some of the microaggressions that we tolerate and don't recognize is, again, because of the way we've been socialized. So I think we, as people of color, have an obligation to continue expanding our lenses and learning more about history and the significance of language as well.
Thank you. And the Google Doc, if you haven't gotten into it yet and want to, there's a link in the chat. It's in there several times. You can click on it anywhere. There's been a very fruitful discussion in the Google Doc, and so I'm just going to call out some of the things that I'm reading here, and but really encourage you all to at least get in there just to read it, even if you don't want to contribute, because it's a very lively discussion. And I think I'm gonna start with what are the challenges Pax Christi must address to embrace the future. Someone wrote, "We need to understand that for decades, Pax Christi USA has completely colonized the theology and praxis of nonviolence in the Catholic Church. We white folks have defined nonviolence through a white lens. We have defined peacemaking in a way that for decades left out the struggle of people of color to end violence in their communities. The first step for white folks is to understand that our understanding of nonviolence and peacemaking is a particular understanding. It is not normative." Someone wrote, "People of color and youth are missing from Pax Christi, and that we should expand the triplets to a quartet and add clericalism," that Pope Francis has often spoke about. "We need to be a church of repentance for the 17 plus centuries of violence, oppression, colonialism, genocide, slavery, and more oppression." I'm going to skip down to question 4. about what you could do outside your comfort zone. Wait a minute, where did that go? Well, I'm sorry, I can't find the answers to those. I don't know where they went. But there was one answer in there that I do remember was that that anytime we mention multicultural, we should also mention anti-racism as part of the discussion. That the two go hand in hand. In terms of what values and priorities need to be embraced, someone wrote, I think a continuing openness to being shaped by younger generations and new voices. Those coming up have been born into multicultural worlds and spaces in ways that us older folk, and the person designates his or her age as 35, that we weren't born into those multicultural worlds and spaces. Some of this is second nature to many, and we can let them own